The sun-drenched suburban street buzzed with excitement as the final touches were put on the Johnson family's backyard. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, and the aroma of freshly cut flowers filled the air. It was the perfect setting for Sarah and Michael's long-awaited wedding day. Little did they know, their celebration of love was about to take an unexpected turn. As guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest, a happy couple greeted them with warm smiles and open arms. Sarah's white dress sparkled in the afternoon light, while Michael's tailored suit complemented her perfectly. Their eyes shone with joy, oblivious to the storm brewing just next door. Mrs. Henderson, the Johnsons' neighbor of 15 years, peered through her curtains with a scowl. The 68-year-old widow had always been particular about noise and gatherings on their quiet street. Today, her intolerance would reach new heights. The ceremony began, filled with heartfelt vows and tender moments. Just as the officiator pronounced Sarah and Michael husband and wife, a commotion erupted at the garden gate. Two police officers appeared, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. "We received a call about a disturbance," one officer explained, his eyes darting between the newlyweds and the sea of shocked faces. A neighbor reported suspicious activity and excessive noise. A hush fell over the gathering. Sarah's father, a usually jovial man, stepped forward with a frown. "There must be some mistake," he said. "This is my daughter's wedding. We have all the proper permits." As the officers conferred, whispers rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned towards Mrs. Henderson's house, where the lace curtains twitched ever so slightly. Michael, still holding Sarah's hand, approached the officers. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. "We'd be happy to address any issues." What happened next would leave the entire neighborhood talking for weeks. As the officers turned to face Michael, their expressions transformed from professional detachment to wide-eyed recognition. "Wait a minute," the younger officer exclaimed. "Aren't you?" Before he could finish, Sarah's maid of honor rushed forward, phone in hand. "Oh my God," she gasped. "You're all over social media. People are furious about what's happening here." The story of the interrupted wedding was spreading like wildfire online. Comments poured in, condemning the apparent racial profiling and praising the couple's grace under pressure. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Henderson, her actions had inadvertently thrust Sarah and Michael into the spotlight for reasons far beyond their nuptials. As tensions rose and confusion mounted, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The crowd parted as a distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit emerged, flanked by two stern-faced individuals who screamed security. "Michael," the man called out, striding purposefully towards the gathering. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you all right?" The pieces began to fall into place for the astonished guests. Michael wasn't just any groom, he was someone of significance, someone whose wedding day disruption would not go unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson, drawn by the commotion, finally emerged from her house. Her face paled as she took in the scene before her, the police, the man in the suit, and the hundreds of eyes now fixed squarely on her. I didn't mean," she stammered, realizing too late the gravity of her actions. Sarah, ever the picture of composure, squeezed Michael's hand and addressed the crowd. "Friends, family, and unexpected guests," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Today is a day of love and unity. Let's not let misunderstanding and prejudice overshadow that." Her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the occasion's true meaning. But questions still swirled. Who exactly was Michael? Why had his identity caused such a stir among the officers? And how would this incident impact not just the newlyweds, but the community as a whole? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the once peaceful street, it became clear that this wedding day would be remembered for reasons no one could have anticipated. The love between Sarah and Michael had been tested in the most public and shocking way, their special day forever intertwined with a larger narrative about judgment, compassion, and the unexpected consequences of a single phone call. The neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see how this extraordinary tale would unfold. Would justice be served? Could bridges be built where fences once stood? And most importantly, would love truly conquer all? As night fell and the fairy lights twinkled even brighter, one thing was certain: the story of Sarah and Michael's wedding was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. A testament to the power of love in the face of adversity, and a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful stories arise from the most unexpected circumstances. The world watched and waited, captivated by the unfolding drama in this quiet suburban street. Little did they know, the revelations to come would shake not just a neighborhood, but spark conversations across the nation. As Sarah and Michael stood united, facing an uncertain future, their love story was poised to become something much bigger than themselves, a catalyst for change, understanding, and perhaps, in time, healing. As the evening progressed, the wedding guests found themselves caught in a surreal moment, torn between celebration and concern. The arrival of the mysterious man in the suit had shifted the atmosphere, leaving everyone eager for answers. Michael, sensing the growing tension, decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. He gently led Sarah to a small raised platform near the dance floor, their fingers intertwined in a show of unity. The crowd hushed, all eyes fixed on the couple. First, I want to thank everyone for being here on what should have been just a joyous occasion. Michael began, his voice steady despite the circumstances. I owe you all an explanation, but more importantly, I owe one to my beautiful wife, Sarah. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a mix of curiosity and unwavering support evident in her gaze. It was clear that even she wasn't fully aware of the situation unfolding around them. Michael took a deep breath before continuing. Many of you know me as Michael Johnson, the software engineer who grew up right here in this neighborhood. But what you don't know is that for the past 5 years, I've been working undercover with a joint task force of the FBI and local law enforcement. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, who had been lingering at the edge of the gathering, clutched her chest in shock. My work has been focused on combating cybercrime and domestic terrorism, Michael explained. The man who arrived earlier is my handler, Agent Thompson. When Mrs. Henderson called the police, it triggered a series of alerts due to my position. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but this revelation only spawned more questions. Sarah, to her credit, remained a pillar of strength beside Michael, though the surprise was evident in her eyes. I never wanted my work to impact our lives like this, Michael said, turning to Sarah with a mix of love and regret. I thought I could keep these two worlds separate. I'm sorry for not telling you everything, Sarah. I was trying to protect you, but I see now that I should have trusted you with the truth. Sarah's response was simple yet powerful. She leaned in and kissed Michael softly, a gesture that spoke volumes about her love and forgiveness. The crowd erupted in applause, moved by this display of unconditional support. As the applause died down, Agent Thompson stepped forward. I apologize for the interruption, he said, addressing the gathering. But I'm afraid this situation has brought some ongoing operations into the light. We'll need to take some precautions to ensure everyone's safety. The word safety sent a shiver through the crowd. What had started as a simple noise complaint had escalated into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Mrs. Henderson, realizing the magnitude of her actions, pushed through the crowd towards Michael and Sarah. I had no idea, she stammered, her earlier hostility replaced by genuine remorse. I'm so sorry, I just thought. I never meant to. Sarah, in a move that surprised everyone, reached out and took Mrs. Henderson's hand. We all make judgments without knowing the full story, she said softly. What matters is how we act once we know better. This moment of reconciliation was interrupted by a commotion at the garden entrance. A group of reporters had gotten wind of the story and were clamoring for comments, their cameras flashing in the twilight. Agent Thompson quickly took charge, instructing his security team to secure the perimeter. We need to control the narrative, he muttered to Michael. This could compromise years of work if not handled correctly. As the security team dealt with the press, Michael's parents approached, confusion and concern etched on their faces. Son, why didn't you tell us? His mother asked, her voice quivering. I couldn't, Mom, Michael replied, the weight of his secret finally lifting. It was for your protection as much as anything. I'm sorry for all the lies, the missed family dinners, the vague explanations about my work. His father, a man of few words, simply pulled Michael into a tight embrace. We're proud of you, son, he whispered, no matter what. Meanwhile, Sarah's bridesmaids huddled around her, offering support and peppering her with questions. Did you have any idea? Her maid of honor asked incredulously. Sarah shook her head, a wry smile playing on her lips. I knew he was passionate about his work, but this is something else entirely. She paused, looking over at Michael with a mix of admiration and newfound curiosity. I guess I have a lot to learn about my husband. As the night wore on, the wedding turned into an impromptu strategy session. Agent Thompson, Michael, and key members of both families sequestered themselves in the Johnsons' living room, discussing next steps and potential fallout. Outside, the party continued in a somewhat subdued fashion. Guests mingled, trading theories and expressing amazement at the turn of events. The story of the wedding was evolving by the minute, growing far beyond a simple tale of a neighborly dispute. In the kitchen, Mrs. Henderson sat with Sarah's mother, both women shell-shocked by the evening's revelations. "I've lived next door to your family for years," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice heavy with regret. "How could I have been so quick to judge?" Sarah's mother patted her hand gently. "We all have our moments of weakness," she replied. "It's what we do next that defines us." As midnight approached, Michael and Sarah finally found a moment alone. They stood at the edge of the garden, the fairy lights casting a soft glow on their faces. "So," Sarah said, a hint of teasing in her voice, "any other secrets you want to share? Are you secretly a superhero too?" Michael chuckled, pulling her close. "No more secrets," he promised. "Though I have to admit, I'm a little worried about what comes next. Our lives might never be the same after tonight." Sarah nodded, her expression turning serious. "I know, but whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's what marriage is about, right? For better or for worse." As they sealed this promise with a kiss, neither could shake the feeling that their wedding day was just the beginning of a much larger adventure. The world was watching, waiting to see how their story would unfold. In the distance, car doors slammed and engines revved to life as the first guests began to depart. Each of them left with a story they'd never forget, a tale of love, prejudice, secrets, and unexpected revelations. And as the night sky twinkled with stars above the Johnsons' backyard, one question lingered in the air. What would tomorrow bring for the newlyweds whose special day had become a national sensation? The morning after the wedding dawned with an eerie calm. Michael and Sarah awoke to find their quiet suburban street transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the curb, reporters camped out on lawns, and curious onlookers drove by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the couple whose wedding had become an overnight sensation. Inside the Johnson home, Michael's parents hosted an impromptu war council. Agent Thompson paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear, while Sarah's father argued in hushed tones with a team of hastily summoned lawyers. The newlyweds sat on the couch, still in their pajamas, watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. "We need to get ahead of this story," Agent Thompson announced, pocketing his phone. "Michael, we're arranging a press conference for this afternoon. We'll present a carefully crafted narrative. Emphasize your work in cybersecurity, downplay the more sensitive aspects of your operations." Michael nodded, his hand finding Sarah's and squeezing gently. "What about Sarah? And our families? How do we protect them from all this attention?" Before Agent Thompson could respond, a commotion outside drew everyone to the window. Mrs. Henderson was attempting to leave her house, only to be swarmed by reporters shouting questions. The elderly woman looked overwhelmed, her earlier remorse now mixed with fear and confusion. Sarah, ever compassionate, made a move towards the door. "We can't just leave her out there like that," she insisted. Michael hesitated, torn between protecting his new wife and helping their neighbor. In that moment of indecision, Sarah's maid of honor burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "You guys need to see this," she exclaimed, thrusting her phone towards them. "The video of Mrs. Henderson calling the cops has gone viral. People are calling her the wedding crasher Karen. It's everywhere." The room fell silent as they watched the shaky footage, clearly captured by one of the wedding guests. Mrs. Henderson's voice could be heard, shrill and demanding, as she complained about the suspicious gathering next door. The video cut to the police arriving, then to Michael calmly addressing the officers. Comments below the video ranged from outrage at Mrs. Henderson's actions to wild speculation about Michael's true identity. Hashtags like #WeddingGate and #UndercoverLove were trending nationwide. "This complicates things," Agent Thompson muttered, rubbing his temples. "We need to contain this before it spirals further out of control." As if on cue, Michael's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID read, Inquiry PDD. With an apologetic glance at Sarah, he stepped out of the room to take the call. Sarah, feeling suddenly overwhelmed, excused herself and retreated to the guest room. As she closed the door behind her, she leaned against it, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. This was not how she had imagined starting her married life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah, it's Mom. Can I come in? Sarah opened the door, falling into her mother's embrace. Oh, honey, her mom soothed, stroking her hair. I know this isn't what you expected, but you're stronger than you know. And that man out there, he loves you more than anything. Don't forget that. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Michael's father was engaged in a heated discussion with some of the wedding guests who had returned, eager for more information. Look, I'm as surprised as any of you, he was saying, his voice strained. But my son is a good man. Whatever his reasons for keeping this secret, I know he was doing what he thought was right. Back inside, Michael returned from his call, his face grave. That was my team, he explained to Agent Thompson. The operation I've been working on for the past year, it's been compromised. They think Mrs. Henderson's call might have tipped off our targets. Agent Thompson swore under his breath. This is exactly what we were afraid of. Michael, I hate to say this, but you and Sarah might need to go into protective custody, at least temporarily. The idea of uprooting their lives so soon after getting married was daunting, but Michael knew the risks better than anyone. As he mulled over this new development, Sarah re-entered the room, her resolve visibly strengthened. Whatever we do it together, she stated firmly, taking Michael's hand. No more secrets, remember? Their moment of unity was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Agent Thompson motioned for everyone to stay back as he cautiously approached, hand hovering near his concealed weapon. He opened the door to reveal a petite, middle-aged woman with a stern expression and a badge clipped to her belt. Agent Thompson, I'm Detective Lisa Chen, local PD. We need to talk about last night's events and certain ongoing investigations in this area. As Detective Chen was ushered inside, the plot thickened. It seemed that Mrs. Henderson's ill-fated call had stirred up more than just a social media frenzy. It had shone a spotlight on a quiet suburban community that perhaps held more secrets than anyone had realized. The next few hours would be crucial. As Michael and Sarah steeled themselves for the press conference, questions swirled. How would they navigate this sudden public exposure? What implications did this have for Michael's undercover work? And most pressingly, were they truly safe, or had last night's events put them in the crosshairs of dangerous individuals? As the clock ticked towards the press conference, tension mounted in the Johnson household. The story of a disrupted wedding had evolved into something far more complex, a tale of hidden identities, cyber warfare, and the unexpected consequences of a single moment of prejudice. And for Michael and Sarah, their journey was only just beginning. The afternoon sun beat down on the hastily assembled podium in front of the Johnson home. Cameras clicked and reporters murmured as Michael and Sarah stepped up to face the media, their hands clasped tightly. Agent Thompson stood nearby, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Michael cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began to address the sea of expectant faces. Good afternoon. I'm here to clarify the events surrounding our wedding yesterday and to address some of the speculation that has been circulating. As Michael spoke, carefully choosing his words, Sarah's gaze drifted to the edge of the gathering. She spotted Mrs. Henderson, looking small and afraid, being interviewed by a local news crew. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Suddenly, Sarah's attention snapped back to Michael as his tone changed, becoming more urgent. What I'm about to say may come as a shock, but it's important that the truth comes to light. Before he could continue, a commotion erupted at the back of the crowd. Detective Chen was pushing her way forward, her face a mask of concern. Stop the press conference, she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the sudden whir of helicopter blades overhead. Panic rippled through the crowd as two black SUVs screeched to a halt at the end of the street. Men in dark suits poured out, their expressions grim and purposeful. Agent Thompson reacted instantly, grabbing Michael and Sarah and hustling them towards the house. We need to get you two out of here now, he hissed, his earlier composure cracking. As they rushed inside, Sarah's parents and Michael's father crowded around them, faces etched with worry. "What's happening?" Sarah's mother cried. There was no time for explanations. Agent Thompson herded them towards the back of the house, barking orders into his comm unit. "The safe house has been compromised. We're initiating Protocol Zeta." Michael's face paled. "Protocol Zeta, but that means—" His words were cut off by the sound of breaking glass. A canister rolled across the kitchen floor, quickly filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. "Gas masks on now," Agent Thompson shouted, distributing masks from a hidden compartment in the wall. Sarah fumbled with hers, her heart pounding in her chest. This was so far removed from the life she had imagined, even just 24 hours ago. As they stumbled towards the back door, a figure loomed out of the smoke. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought they'd been caught. Then she recognized Mrs. Henderson, coughing and disoriented. "We can't leave her," Sarah insisted, grabbing the older woman's arm. Michael hesitated for a split second before nodding, helping to guide Mrs. Henderson along with them. They burst out into the backyard, the very place where, just yesterday, they had exchanged their vows. Now, it was a scene of chaos. A helicopter circled low overhead, its spotlight sweeping across the grass. "This way," Agent Thompson urged, leading them towards a hidden gate in the back fence. As they reached it, gunshots rang out, splintering the wood mere inches from Michael's head. Sarah suppressed a scream, her grip on Mrs. Henderson tightening. The elderly woman looked shell-shocked, her earlier remorse now replaced by sheer terror. They ducked through the gate into the alley behind, where a nondescript van was waiting. "Get in," Detective Chen called from the driver's seat, her earlier antagonism replaced by urgent cooperation. As they piled into the van, Michael turned to Agent Thompson. "What about our parents? We can't just leave them." "Another team is extracting them as we speak," Thompson assured him, slamming the van door shut. "Right now, our priority is getting you two to safety." The van peeled away just as figures in black tactical gear rounded the corner of the house. Sarah watched through the rear window as her home, and the life she had known, receded into the distance. "I don't understand," Mrs. Henderson whimpered, finally finding her voice. "Who are those people? What do they want?" Michael and Sarah exchanged a look. How could they explain that Mrs. Henderson's misguided call had not only disrupted their wedding, but had potentially exposed a years-long operation against a dangerous cyber-terrorist network? As the van weaved through back streets, avoiding main roads, Detective Chen spoke up. "We've suspected for months that there was a mole in our department, feeding information to the cyber-terror cell. When Mrs. Henderson's call came in, it set off a chain reaction. The cell realized their operation was at risk of exposure. And now they're after us," Michael concluded grimly. "But why bring the fight out into the open like this? It doesn't make sense." Before anyone could respond, the van lurched violently. Detective Chen swore, fighting to maintain control. "We've got company," she announced, her voice tense. "2 motorcycles coming up fast." Sarah turned to see 2 sleep bikes gaining on them, their riders' faces obscured by tinted visors. As she watched in horror, one of the riders raised what looked like a high-tech weapon. "Everyone down," Agent Thompson yelled, just as the rear window exploded in a shower of glass. In that moment, as she huddled on the floor of the van with her new husband and the neighbor who had inadvertently turned their lives upside down, Sarah realized that their story was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous chapter was just beginning. The van swerved sharply, tires screeching as Detective Chen fought to evade their pursuers. Where were they going? Who could they trust? And most pressingly, would Sarah and Michael's love survive this ultimate test? As the chase continued through the streets of their once quiet suburb, one thing became clear. The next few hours would determine not just their fate, but potentially the security of the entire nation. The wedding that had started with a neighbor's misguided call was now at the center of a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with cyber-terrorists, undercover agents, and one very overwhelmed couple caught in the middle. The van careened around another corner, the pursuing motorcycles still hot on their trail. Sarah clung to Michael, her wedding dress now torn and dirty, a far cry from the pristine white it had been just a day ago. Mrs. Henderson whimpered softly, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Suddenly, Detective Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "We got a problem. The safe house coordinates have been compromised. We need a new plan, fast." Agent Thompson cursed under his breath, his usually calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. How was that possible? Those coordinates were known only to a select few. A heavy silence fell over the van as the implications sank in. Michael was the first to voice what they were all thinking. There's another mole. Someone high up in the operation. Before anyone could respond, the van lurched violently as one of the motorcycles pulled alongside. The rider, face obscured by a black helmet, raised what looked like a sophisticated hacking device. Sparks flew from the van's dashboard, and suddenly they were careening out of control. "Hang on!" Detective Chen shouted, wrestling with the steering wheel as they spun across lanes of traffic. Horns blared and tires screeched as other drivers swerved to avoid them. In the chaos, Sarah's eyes locked onto something that made her blood run cold. A familiar face in one of the passing cars, watching their van with an expression of grim satisfaction. It couldn't be, but it was. "Michael," she gasped, grabbing her husband's arm. "I just saw your boss from the software company. He was watching us." Michael's face paled. "That's impossible. Unless..." His voice trailed off as the pieces started falling into place. "Oh God, we've been played from the start." As if on cue, Agent Thompson's phone buzzed with an incoming message. His eyes widened as he read it. "This is bigger than we thought," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of screeching tires. "The cyber terror cell isn't just after state secrets. They're after something called Project Oracle." Mrs. Henderson, who had been quiet until now, suddenly perked up. "Oracle? I've heard that name before. My late husband. He used to work on a top-secret government project. He never told me much, but I remember him mentioning Oracle." All eyes turned to the elderly woman, whose earlier fear was now replaced by a look of fierce determination. It seemed Mrs. Henderson had depths they hadn't imagined. Before they could question her further, the van finally came to a shuddering halt, smoke billowing from the engine. They had ended up in an abandoned industrial park, surrounded by dilapidated warehouses. "We need to move, now," Agent Thompson ordered, ushering everyone out of the van. "Our pursuers will be here any second." As they ran towards the nearest warehouse, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. But it wasn't just the motorcycles this time. A convoy of black SUVs was bearing down on them, their tinted windows hiding the faces of those inside. They barely made it inside the warehouse, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind them. In the dim light, they could make out rows of dusty crates and forgotten machinery. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking but determined. She had married Michael for better or for worse, and she wasn't about to back down now. Michael squeezed her hand, his mind racing. "We need to figure out what Project Oracle is and why it's so important. Mrs. Henderson, can you remember anything else your husband might have said?" The older woman furrowed her brow in concentration. "He mentioned something about a failsafe, said it was hidden in plain sight, where no one would think to look." Suddenly, a voice crackled over a hidden speaker system, filling the warehouse. "Well done, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. You've led us right where we want you." Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the voice. It was Michael's boss, the man she had spotted earlier. The betrayal cut deep, but there was no time for recriminations. "What do you want?" Michael shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "Why, we want you, of course," the voice replied, tinged with amusement. "Or more specifically, we want what's inside your head. You see, Michael, you're not just an undercover agent. You're the key to Project Oracle, whether you realize it or not." The sound of footsteps echoed from all directions as armed figures emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the small group. Agent Thompson and Detective Chen moved to form a protective circle around Michael, Sarah, and Mrs. Henderson, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. As the net closed in around them, Sarah's mind raced. What did Michael's boss mean? How could Michael be the key to something he knew nothing about? And most importantly, how were they going to get out of this alive? The warehouse fell silent, the tension palpable as both sides faced off. It was clear that the next few moments would determine not just their fate, but potentially the course of national security. Sarah looked at Michael, seeing the same mix of fear and determination in his eyes that she felt. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Their wedding might have been interrupted, their lives turned upside down, but their love and commitment to each other remained unshaken. As the standoff continued, one thing was certain. This was far from over. The true test of their vows, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, was only just beginning. The tension in the warehouse was palpable as Michael's former boss, now revealed as the mastermind behind the cyber terror cell, stepped out of the shadows. His smirk was a stark contrast to the grim faces of Michael, Sarah, and their unlikely allies. "You see, Michael," the man began, his voice echoing through the cavernous space, "Project Oracle isn't just a program or a piece of technology. It's a person, and that person is you." Michael's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? I don't know anything about Project Oracle." "Oh, but you do?" his ex-boss countered. "It's buried deep in your subconscious. Years ago, your father, the brilliant scientist he was, developed a revolutionary AI system capable of predicting and preventing cyber attacks on a global scale, but he knew it was too dangerous to exist as a standalone system." Sarah gasped as the pieces started falling into place. She turned to Michael, whose face had gone pale with shock. "Your recurring nightmares," she whispered. "The ones you could never quite remember." The mastermind nodded approvingly. "Smart girl. You see, Michael's father found a way to encode the entire Oracle system into his son's brain through a series of subliminal messages and triggers. Michael is, quite literally, a human hard drive containing the most powerful cybersecurity system ever created." As this revelation sank in, Mrs. Henderson suddenly stepped forward, her earlier timidity replaced by a steely resolve. "That's why Henry was so secretive," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "He wasn't just Michael's neighbor. He was part of the team protecting him." Before anyone could react to this new information, a deafening explosion rocked the warehouse. The wall behind the cyber terrorists crumbled, revealing a team of heavily armed agents led by none other than Michael's father. "Step away from my son," he commanded, his voice filled with a mixture of authority and parental concern. Chaos erupted as both sides engaged in a firefight. Michael pulled Sarah behind a stack of crates, his mind reeling from the revelations. "I'm so sorry," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I had no idea." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Hey, for better or for worse, remember? We're in this together." Suddenly, Mrs. Henderson appeared beside them, clutching something in her hand. "Henry gave me this before he died," she said, pressing a small device into Michael's palm. "He said if the time ever came, it would unlock the Oracle system in your mind." Michael stared at the device, a simple-looking thumb drive with a single button. As gunfire continued to rage around them, he knew he had to make a choice. Activating Oracle could give them the upper hand, but it might also change him forever. Sarah saw the conflict in his eyes and placed her hand over his on the device. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," she said softly. With a deep breath, Michael pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes widened as a flood of information coursed through his mind. Strings of code, security protocols, and predictive algorithms all became clear to him in an instant. Standing up, Michael faced the ongoing battle with newfound confidence. His fingers flew over a nearby abandoned computer terminal, and suddenly, every electronic device in the warehouse came to life. "I'm shutting down their weapons and communication systems," he announced, his voice steady and assured. "And I'm sending their locations to every law enforcement agency within 100 miles. The mastermind, realizing his plan was falling apart, made a desperate lunge for Michael. But Sarah, channeling all her fear and anger from the past 24 hours, stepped in and landed a perfect right hook, sending the man sprawling. As sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the approach of reinforcements, the remaining terrorists surrendered. Michael's father rushed over, enveloping his son in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry we had to keep this from you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We thought we were protecting you." As the dust settled and the authorities began rounding up the cyber terrorists, Michael turned to Sarah, Mrs. Henderson, Agent Thompson, and Detective Chen. "Thank you," he said simply, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "We couldn't have done this without each of you." Mrs. Henderson smiled wryly. "Well, I suppose my call to the police wasn't such a bad thing after all," she quipped, earning a chuckle from the group. As they walked out of the warehouse into the bright sunlight, Sarah linked her arm through Michael's. "So, Mr. Johnson," she said with a smile, "any other secret superpowers I should know about?" Michael laughed, pulling her close. "Just one," he replied, leaning in for a kiss, "the power of having an amazing wife who stands by me no matter what." But as they embraced, celebrating their victory and newfound understanding, neither of them noticed the small, linking device attached to the underside of a nearby car. A tiny red light pulsed steadily, suggesting that perhaps their adventure was not quite over yet. The newlyweds had overcome prejudice, uncovered a massive conspiracy, and unlocked hidden potential. But as they prepared to step into their new life together, it seemed the world had a few more surprises in store for the couple whose wedding day had turned into an international incident. Their story, it appeared, was far from over. As the sun began to set on the most extraordinary day of their lives, Michael and Sarah found themselves back at their home, surrounded by their families, Mrs. Henderson, and the law enforcement officers who had become unlikely allies. The street was quieter now, the media circus having moved on to the next big story. But for those gathered in the Johnsons' living room, the events of the past 24 hours were far from over. Michael's father, Dr. Johnson, cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I owe you all an explanation," he began, his voice heavy with years of secrets. Project Oracle was meant to be the ultimate defense against cyber warfare. But as we developed it, we realized its power could be catastrophic in the wrong hands. Sarah squeezed Michael's hand as they listened. Her new husband's eyes were focused intently on his father, years of unanswered questions finally finding resolution. "We decided the safest place to hide Oracle was somewhere no one would think to look, in the mind of an ordinary person," Dr. Johnson continued. "Michael, we chose you not just because you're my son, but because of your inherent integrity and strength of character." Mrs. Henderson spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "Henry, my late husband. He was part of the security detail assigned to watch over Michael. That's why we moved to this neighborhood all those years ago." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "All this time, I thought I was protecting others with my undercover work. I never imagined I was the one being protected." Agent Thompson leaned forward, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "The question now is, what happens next? Michael, with Oracle active in your mind, you're possibly the most valuable asset in national cybersecurity." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But before Michael could respond, Detective Chen's phone buzzed urgently. "We've got a problem," she announced, her face grim. "That device we found on the car after the warehouse showdown, it wasn't just a tracker. It was a data siphon. Someone's been downloading information, presumably from Michael's activated Oracle system." The room erupted in a flurry of activity. As agents made calls and Dr. Johnson consulted with Detective Chen, Sarah pulled Michael aside. "Hey," she said softly, cupping his face in her hands. "How are you holding up?" Michael managed a small smile. "Honestly, I'm terrified. But having you here, it makes all the difference." Their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson, who approached with a determined look in her eye. "I may be old," she began, "but I'm not useless. Michael, I've been thinking about something Henry once mentioned. He said the true power of Oracle wasn't just in predicting cyber attacks, but in its ability to adapt and evolve." Michael's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Of course," he breathed. "It's not just about the information in my head. It's about how that information can change and grow." With renewed purpose, Michael strode to the center of the room. "Everyone, listen up," he called out, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even him. "We don't need to shut Oracle down or keep it hidden anymore. We need to let it do what it was designed to do: evolve." Over the next few hours, Michael worked with his father and a team of hastily assembled cybersecurity experts to develop a plan. They would create a secure network, allowing Oracle to interface with global security systems without risking Michael's personal safety. As dawn broke, casting a soft glow over the suburban street, the team finally emerged from the makeshift command center that had been set up in the Johnsons' basement. Sarah, who had been anxiously waiting upstairs with Mrs. Henderson, rushed to meet them. "Well?" she asked, searching Michael's face for clues. Michael's tired expression broke into a grin. It worked. Oracle is now distributed across multiple secure servers worldwide. I'm no longer the sole keeper of the system, but I can still access and guide it when needed. Dr. Johnson clapped his son on the shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. You've done something remarkable, son. You've taken Oracle beyond what we ever imagined it could be. As the group celebrated this breakthrough, Mrs. Henderson quietly slipped out the front door. Sarah, noticing her absence, followed her outside. She found the older woman standing on her own front porch, gazing thoughtfully at the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah called softly. Is everything okay? The elderly neighbor turned, a wistful smile on her face. You know, when I made that call to the police, I thought I was protecting our quiet little street. I never imagined I'd end up being part of something so much bigger. Sarah joined her on the porch, the two women looking out at the peaceful morning scene. I think that's true for all of us, she replied. Sometimes the smallest actions can lead to the biggest changes. Back inside, Michael was wrapping up a call with Agent Thompson. As he hung up, he turned to address the room. The immediate threat has been neutralized. The team that tried to download Oracle's data has been apprehended, but our work is far from over. Dr. Johnson nodded solemnly. Oracle will need constant monitoring and guidance. Michael, are you prepared for what that means? Michael looked at Sarah, who had just re-entered the room with Mrs. Henderson. In that moment, he saw not just his wife, but his partner in every sense of the word. We're prepared, he answered, emphasizing the we. As the various officials and experts began to file out, making plans for future meetings and security protocols, Michael and Sarah found themselves alone in their living room for the first time since their wedding ceremony. Some honeymoon, huh? Michael quipped, pulling Sarah close. She laughed, resting her head on his chest. Well, you did promise me an adventurous life together. As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of their home, both reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a simple prejudice phone call. They had faced danger, uncovered long-buried secrets, and emerged stronger, both as individuals and as a couple. Outside, Mrs. Henderson was shooing away the last of the curious neighbors who had gathered during the night's commotion. Nothing to see here, she declared with newfound authority. Just a newlywed couple enjoying their first day of marriage. And in a way, she was right. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, Michael and Sarah were, at their core, simply two people deeply in love, ready to face whatever challenges life might throw their way. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the suburban street began to return to its normal rhythm. But for the Johnsons and their neighbors, nothing would ever be quite the same. They had been part of something bigger than themselves, a reminder that heroism and world-changing events can happen in the most unexpected places, even on a quiet street where a wedding day turned into an unforgettable adventure. Michael and Sarah knew that their life together would never be ordinary. With Oracle as part of their reality, they would always be on the front lines of keeping the digital world safe. But as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew they wouldn't have it any other way. Their love story had become intertwined with a tale of national security, cyber warfare, and the power of human connection. As they finally sat down to enjoy their first meal as a married couple, reheated leftovers from the wedding reception, Michael raised his glass in a toast. To us, he said softly, and to all the adventures yet to come. Sarah clinked her glass against his, her eyes shining with love and excitement for their future. To us, she echoed. And to the power of love to overcome any obstacle, even a wedding crashed by cybercriminals. They laughed together, the sound of their joy filling the house. Outside, Mrs. Henderson smiled to herself as she watered her garden, keeping a watchful eye on the street she had once thought she knew so well. The world had changed, but some things, like the strength of community and the power of love, remained constant. And so, as life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, a new chapter began for Michael and Sarah Johnson. Their wedding day may not have gone as planned, but it had set the stage for a life filled with purpose, adventure, and unwavering love. The story of the wedding that turned into an international incident would be told for years to come, a testament to the unexpected ways that life can transform us all.